hate the fact that I'm ever even slightly compared to them. I just never, ever liked them. It's a real problem for me because as people, I think they're all really, really great guys. Just never liked the band. And I don't know whether I've just got a problem block to them because they...
Pete Townshend has never been afraid to speak his mind, even if it means making enemies in the music world. The Who's iconic guitarist is known for smashing guitars and smashing egos, often clashing with fellow legends. Over the years, he's called out some of the biggest names in rock, leaving no doubt about who rubbed him the wrong way. Here are the 6 musicians Townshend openly admitted he couldn't stand. Jimmy Page. Among the many musicians Pete Townshend has commented on throughout his career, few drew his fire more often than Jimmy Page, the legendary guitarist of Led Zeppelin. To Townshend, Page was not just another player in the crowded rock scene of the late 1960s and 1970s, he was the very embodiment of the style Townshend disdained, indulgent, flashy, and steeped in showmanship. What made Townshend's criticisms particularly striking was the contrast between his view of Page as a person and as a performer. He never denied that Page was, in his words, a really great guy. Offstage, Townshend acknowledged Page's intelligence, warmth, and even charm. Yet the moment the guitar came out, his opinion changed sharply. He dismissed Page's playing as flash, suggesting that it was designed more to impress the audience with spectacle than to convey the raw emotion or structural innovation that Townshend believed defined meaningful rock music. For him, Page's style leaned toward arrogance, a kind of self-indulgence that didn't serve the song so much as it served the ego of the performer. A major source of Townshend's irritation lay in the frequent comparisons between The Who and Led Zeppelin. Fans and critics alike often paired the two bands, noting their aggressive volume, hard-hitting rhythms, and theatricality on stage. But Townshend bristled at these parallels, feeling that they diminished The Who's originality. In particular, he accused Page of borrowing from The Who's heavy live sound, pointing to their landmark album Live at Leeds as a blueprint Zeppelin allegedly followed. To Townshend, it was as though Zeppelin had taken his band's groundbreaking work, magnified the bombast, and then reaped greater commercial and critical rewards for it. This sense of being overshadowed stung deeply. The Who had carved out their reputation through innovation. Townshend's pioneering use of feedback, power chords, and thematic concept albums set them apart from their contemporaries. Yet Zeppelin, in his eyes, epitomized rock's descent into excess. Long solos, mythic posturing, and an almost gladiatorial relationship with their audience. Whereas Townshend saw The Who's music as rooted in vulnerability, narrative, and experimentation, Zeppelin seemed to revel in grandeur and hedonism. Still, even in his sharpest critiques, Townshend could not deny Page's sheer technical ability. He recognized that Page's precision, speed, and creativity on the guitar were exceptional, even revolutionary. Page's ability to move seamlessly from delicate acoustic passages to thunderous electric riffs made him one of the defining players of his generation. Townshend respected the craft, but rejected the philosophy behind it. To him, Page represented the triumph of rock theatrics over rock substance, a victory of spectacle over soul. The dynamic between the two men reflected a broader clash of ideals within rock music itself. Townshend, with his background in art school and his intellectual approach to songwriting, viewed rock as a medium for serious cultural expression, a way to explore themes of identity, alienation, and social change. Page, by contrast, leaned into rock's mysticism and sensuality, embracing the role of the guitar god who could mesmerize a stadium. This divergence fueled not only Townshend's disdain, but also the rivalry between their bands, with The Who seen as the cerebral counterpart to Zeppelin's visceral power. George Harrison. In the 1960s, few bands cast as long a shadow over popular music as the Beatles, yet Pete Townshend was one of the rare figures who dared to voice skepticism at the height of Beatlemania. While he later came to admire George Harrison and his artistry, Townshend's early opinions were marked by sharp dismissals of the group's musicianship. He famously claimed that without vocals, the Beatles' backing tracks were flippin' lousy. It was a remark that implicitly touched on Harrison's guitar playing, as well as the rhythm section of Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. For Townshend, the driving force of rock was about power, raw energy, and experimentation, qualities he felt the Beatles often lacked in their polished sound. Townshend's criticisms were not aimed at Harrison alone, but the guitarist inevitably fell under their scope. Harrison's style was always more melodic, understated, and supportive, weaving textures into the fabric of Beatles songs rather than dominating them. While millions of fans found his guitar work tasteful, inventive, and even spiritual, Townshend viewed it through a different lens. To him, it didn't embody the visceral punch of rock and roll. Compared to the crashing chords, feedback experimentation, and explosive stage presence of The Who, Harrison's contributions seemed too delicate, too polite. This difference in philosophy underscored a broader contrast between the two bands. The Who emerged as a visceral force in the mid-1960s, channeling teenage frustration and rebellion into sheer sonic assault. Townshend smashed guitars, Keith Moon pounded the drums like a thunderstorm, and Roger Daltrey roared with primal energy. By contrast, the Beatles had already shifted from their early rock and roll roots into more refined, studio-centered experimentation. Their songs were crafted with precision and layered production, qualities that Townshend, at least in the 1960s, equated with a lack of authenticity. Harrison's role in this dynamic was particularly interesting. He was never the showman Page was, nor the virtuoso Eric Clapton was, but he had an uncanny gift for finding the right notes, the right textures, and the right mood. His work on tracks like And I Love Her or Something displayed subtlety and restraint that later guitarists would praise as genius. But in Townshend's younger years, subtlety was not the measure of greatness. He wanted rock to be forceful, dangerous, and overwhelming, and Harrison's approach didn't match that vision. Still, time softened Townshend's view. By the 1970s and beyond, as the noise of competition and comparison faded, he came to acknowledge Harrison's value. He grew to appreciate not only Harrison's musicianship, but also his spiritual depth and individuality. Harrison's exploration of Indian music, his collaboration with Ravi Shankar, and his solo work, especially All Things Must Pass, revealed a dimension that Townshend could no longer dismiss as lousy. In fact, Harrison's melodic sensitivity helped define the Beatles' legacy as much as Lennon's sharpness or McCartney's tunefulness. Townshend himself admitted that his early comments reflected the tribalism of the 1960s rock scene. Bands often competed for space in a crowded musical landscape, and part of The Who's identity relied on separating themselves from the Beatles' dominance. Dismissing their musicianship, then, was also a way of asserting The Who's rawer authenticity. If the Beatles represented the clean-cut, crowd-pleasing side of British rock, The Who wanted to be its feral, unpolished counterpart. Harrison, caught in the crossfire, became collateral in this sweeping critique. The irony is that Harrison's influence has endured precisely because of the qualities Townshend once dismissed. His emphasis on melody over flash, his knack for restraint, and his role in shaping the Beatles' sound have inspired generations of guitarists. Townshend's own legacy, meanwhile, rests on his invention of the power chord, his use of feedback, and his sheer physicality with the instrument. Where Harrison whispered, Townshend shouted. Where Harrison carved space for the song, Townshend made the guitar itself the center of drama. Both approaches became essential chapters in the evolution of rock. Les Paul among Pete. Townshend's many blunt remarks about fellow musicians, perhaps his most startling, were aimed at Les Paul, the man often credited as one of the true architects of modern electric guitar music. While most guitarists, regardless of genre, have spoken of Les Paul with near reverence, praising his pioneering role in both instrument design and recording technology, Townshend broke from the chorus. In the early 1980s, he confessed with startling directness, "I hated Les Paul. I've never liked Flash playing, really." The comment shocked many, not only because of Les Paul's towering legacy, but because it cut against the grain of the way musicians typically spoke about him. By the time Townshend made that remark, Paul was already regarded as a living legend, a figure whose experiments with solid-body guitar design and multi-track recording had reshaped the possibilities of popular music. Yet Townshend was never one to bow to consensus. To him, Les Paul's style represented everything he resisted: virtuosic flash, technical gymnastics, and a kind of performance that dazzled on the surface but, in his eyes, lacked true emotional depth. Townshend's rejection of Les Paul was not rooted in ignorance of his contributions. If anything, it was in spite of them. He knew full well that Paul had revolutionized the guitar as both a physical instrument and as a recording medium. Without Paul's innovations, the amplified rock sound The Who unleashed on the world might not have even been possible. But for Townshend, that historical achievement did not excuse what he saw as superficiality in Paul's actual playing. His critique drew a sharp line between invention and artistry. One could invent the tool, but that didn't mean one wielded it in the most meaningful way. Instead of admiring Les Paul, Townshend gravitated toward guitarists he considered more thoughtful and emotionally engaging. He often cited Wes Montgomery, the jazz guitarist whose fluid lines and octave-driven melodies carried warmth and soul, and Chet Atkins, the country virtuoso whose fingerpicking combined technical mastery with melodic grace. These were players who, to Townshend, used their skill to elevate the music rather than themselves. In contrast, Les Paul's performances struck him as empty displays of virtuosity, impressive in speed and precision, but ultimately shallow. What made Townshend's dismissal so provocative was that it flew in the face of how most of the music world viewed Les Paul. For decades, Paul had been celebrated as both a technical genius and an engaging performer. His jazz-tinged guitar lines, his smooth stage presence, and his groundbreaking use of technology made him a household name alongside his wife and musical partner, Mary Ford. Yet for Townshend, all the showmanship only amplified the problem. He had little patience for guitar idol worship and bristled at the idea of elevating technical fireworks over raw expression. The irony is that Townshend himself became one of the most influential guitarists of his generation. Not because of technical prowess in the Les Paul mold, but because of his innovation in rhythm, sound, and performance. His power chords, use of feedback, and aggressive windmill strumming redefined what the guitar could do in rock, and his on-stage destruction of instruments turned the act of playing into a statement about art and rebellion. He didn't need dazzling solos. He created drama through sheer energy and conceptual ambition. Jimi Hendrix. Few relationships in rock history capture the strange blend of awe, rivalry, and insecurity as clearly as Pete Townshend's feelings toward Jimi Hendrix. Unlike his outright dismissals of other guitarists, Townshend never hated Hendrix. Instead, his emotions were layered, deep admiration for Hendrix's genius, coupled with frustration and even regret that his presence often cast the Who into the shadows. For Townshend, Hendrix represented both the best and most troubling aspects of the late 1960s rock scene: dazzling innovation, boundary-breaking artistry, and a level of showmanship that made even the Who's notorious stage antics feel outmatched. Townshend often spoke of Hendrix's brilliance in unequivocal terms. He recognized that Hendrix was more than just a guitarist. He was an otherworldly force, capable of wringing sounds from the instrument that no one had imagined before. His fusion of blues, psychedelia, and raw experimentation changed the vocabulary of the electric guitar almost overnight. Even Townshend, a man rarely generous in his praise of rivals, admitted Hendrix's music left him stunned. Genius was the word he used, and it was not a term he offered lightly. Yet alongside this admiration was a gnawing sense of regret and envy. One famous anecdote reveals just how personal this became for Townshend. He once offered Hendrix advice about amplifier setups, sharing tips about achieving volume and sustain. Later, he confessed with a rueful laugh, "I wish I'd never given him the tip." The remark was half joking, half serious, a recognition that in helping Hendrix unlock even greater sonic power, he had contributed, in some small way, to his own band being overshadowed. The tension grew sharper because Hendrix's live performances often seemed to outdo The Who at their own game. The Who had built their reputation not just on music but on spectacle. Townshend's windmill strumming, Keith Moon's manic drumming, and most famously, the ritual of smashing guitars and wrecking gear. This act of destruction was meant as a statement: rock as rebellion, chaos as art. But when Hendrix set fire to his guitar at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, he raised the stakes to a level that even Townshend struggled to match. What had once seemed shocking and original suddenly felt like it had been one-upped. Townshend himself admitted to feeling uneasy about Hendrix's theatrics. While he respected the artistry behind Hendrix's playing, he was less comfortable with the way stage destruction became a competition. It wasn't that he resented Hendrix personally. Townshend always emphasized he liked and respected him, but the presence of Hendrix made every Who performance feel like a contest. Could they still shock audiences when Hendrix was on the same bill? Could their sound feel as groundbreaking when Hendrix seemed to reinvent the guitar every night? The result was a relationship defined by ambivalence. Townshend never hid his admiration. He spoke openly of Hendrix's creativity, charisma, and revolutionary spirit. But the envy was always just beneath the surface, fueled by a sense that Hendrix had eclipsed The Who in the very arena where they had once reigned supreme. Townshend felt both proud to have shared a stage with him and frustrated that those stages often belonged, in spirit, to Hendrix alone. What makes this dynamic so compelling is that Hendrix himself never seemed to view it as a rivalry. By most accounts, he admired The Who and enjoyed their company. The competition was largely internal, Townshend wrestling with his own feelings of being outshone. In later years, as the myth of Hendrix grew after his tragic death in 1970, Townshend's comments reflected both wistfulness and relief. He acknowledged Hendrix's unmatched genius, but also hinted at the burden of constantly being measured against him. Kurt Cobain. Few moments in Pete Townshend's public commentary were as unflinching as his remarks on Kurt Cobain, the frontman of Nirvana, when Townshend reviewed Cobain's journals in the 1990s. Townshend did not mince words. He described the writings as the scribblings of a crazed and depressed drug addict, going further to label them stinking thinking, a term rooted in rehabilitation culture for the toxic mental patterns that often accompany substance abuse. The critique was stark, raw, and deeply personal, reflecting both Townshend's moral clarity and his sense of responsibility as a figure who had grappled with his own struggles in rock and rehab. While Townshend acknowledged Cobain's talent and his cultural impact, he seemed deeply unsettled by the way the younger musician's despair and nihilism mirrored themes he himself had explored decades earlier. Cobain's fixation on youth, death, and the disillusionment of fame echoed. The Who's famous lyric, "I hope I die before I get old," a line from my generation that had become an anthem for teenage rebellion. Yet whereas Townshend had written the lyric as a statement of youthful defiance and social critique, he felt Cobain had imbued similar sentiments with a tragic and destructive romanticism, turning rebellion into literalized self-destruction. This distinction, the difference between anger as art and despair as lifestyle, was central to Townshend's disapproval. Townshend's critique also reflected generational distance. By the 1990s, he had survived decades in rock, confronted personal demons, and undergone rehabilitation for his own substance issues. He had lived through the temptations, the excesses, and the mythologies of rock and roll, and had emerged with a more tempered perspective. Cobain, in contrast, was emblematic of a new generation that seemed to glorify self-destruction as an essential component of authenticity. Townshend's comments were therefore as much about mentorship from afar as they were about literary judgment. He was warning against the romanticization of suffering, of turning depression and addiction into aesthetic badges. There was also a moral dimension to Townshend's reaction. He expressed sympathy for Cobain's struggles, recognizing the pressures of fame, artistic expectation, and personal pain. Yet his sympathy did not translate into indulgence. Where many contemporaries of Cobain might have excused the dark obsessions as tortured genius, Townshend refused to shy away from labeling them harmful patterns. His use of the phrase stinking thinking carries weight not only as rehab terminology, but as a moral critique, an insistence that destructive thought patterns should be named and challenged, not celebrated. The tension in Townshend's response illustrates a broader dialogue between rock generations. Cobain's fame rested on raw emotion, grunge ethos, and the allure of nihilism, while Townshend's approach had always sought a balance between intensity and responsibility. He understood darkness, but aimed to channel it creatively and avoid self-annihilation. The dissonance between these approaches shaped Townshend's sharp commentary. Cobain's journals, brimming with angst and self-pity, appeared to him as evidence of surrender rather than mastery, an abdication of agency in the name of artistic identity. Tragically, Townshend's criticisms gained an added layer of poignancy after Cobain's death in 1994. In hindsight, his warnings about glorifying destructive patterns felt almost prescient, highlighting the danger inherent in conflating rock mythos with personal self-destruction. Townshend's review was therefore more than an aesthetic critique. It was an attempt to interrogate the cultural scripts that perpetuate suffering as art. It underscored the generational responsibility that older musicians often feel toward those who follow, even as they recognize the limitations of influence. Paul McCartney. Among Pete Townshend's more controversial critiques, few were as blunt as his remarks about Paul McCartney, the melodic heart of the Beatles. In a 1982 interview with Rolling Stone, Townshend asked rhetorically, "Did he ever really have anything to do with rock?" No. The statement startled many readers, especially given McCartney's reputation as one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century. Yet Townshend's criticism was rooted in a specific philosophy of music, a belief that true rock required raw power, visceral energy, and the ability to provoke as much as it entertained. To him, McCartney's brilliance in melody and harmony, though undeniable, lacked the aggressive force that defined rock and roll's spirit. Townshend saw McCartney as the embodiment of the Beatles' pop sensibility. While John Lennon often injected acerbic wit and social commentary, and George Harrison contributed subtle innovation and texture, McCartney specialized in crafting lush, melodic compositions that appealed to mass audiences. Songs like Yesterday, Michelle, or Hey Jude demonstrated extraordinary musicality, showing McCartney's genius for hooks, orchestration, and vocal nuance. Yet for Townshend, these qualities, impressive as they were, failed to deliver the raw immediacy and physical intensity he prized in rock music. In other words, McCartney wrote songs that charmed the ear, but they did not shake the foundations of a stage or physically assault the senses the way The Who's music often did. The critique also reflected Townshend's competitive sensibility. The Who's emergence in the mid-1960s coincided with the Beatles' global dominance, and while Townshend respected their musicianship, he was determined to differentiate his band's approach. The Who were loud, aggressive, and confrontational, musically and visually. Townshend smashed guitars, Keith Moon destroyed drum kits, and Roger Daltrey's vocals roared with unpolished urgency. McCartney, in contrast, epitomized a polished, controlled, and audience-friendly aesthetic. To Townshend, this distinction went beyond style. It represented a philosophical divide, rock as force versus rock as confection. Over time, however, Townshend's position softened. With decades of reflection, he began acknowledging McCartney's immense cultural impact and unparalleled influence on modern music. He recognized the scope of McCartney's talent, his innovation in songwriting, and his contributions to popularizing complex musical forms within the framework of accessible songs. McCartney's ability to blend pop sensibility with experimental touches, especially in albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, or Band on the Run, demonstrated a sophistication that even Townshend, with his purist rock perspective, could not entirely dismiss. Yet even as Townshend softened, he never fully retracted his early critiques. There remained, in his view, a gap between McCartney's pop-oriented genius and the raw power, aggression, and rebelliousness that defined the ethos of The Who. McCartney's music, he suggested, could move millions and inspire generations, but it did so without the physical, confrontational edge that Townshend believed was essential to rock's core identity. It was a distinction that highlighted Townshend's ongoing commitment to a particular conception of rock, one that demanded visceral impact as much as melodic brilliance. Townshend's remarks illuminate a broader tension in 20th century music, the divide between the intellectual, melodic side of rock and the primal, emotional, and performative side. McCartney's work represented craft, beauty, and universality, while Townshend's vision emphasized immediacy, confrontation, and raw energy. Both approaches were influential, but Townshend's critiques remind us that admiration in rock history is often filtered through personal taste and aesthetic priorities, not just technical achievement or popular success. What do you think about the musicians that Pete Townshend hates? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.